Hello and welcome to Holyrood Sources. It's a special episode today, actually, where we're going to spend quite a bit of time in some good company. That notwithstanding, also here as ever, Geoff Aberdein, former Chief of Staff to the First Minister Alex Salmond. Hello, Geoff.
Good morning.
Hello, and Andy Maciver, who was Director of Communications for the Scottish Conservatives. Hello, Andy.
Good morning.
Lots more conversation to come on the podcast. Throughout the course of the next few weeks, there's lots to consider. The conclusion of the Scottish Conservative leadership contest, of course. The UK government budget will be here in, well, the not too distant future, and the implications of that for Scotland will be discussed on the podcast. There's loads to come, loads and loads to come. Today, though, we are very pleased to be in the company of Michael Moore, who was the Secretary of State for Scotland between 2010 and 2013. He was a Lib Dem MP between 1997 and 2015, and he's now the Chief Executive of the British Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here, and I've listened for a very long time to all these great conversations, and delighted to be part of it today.
Well, it's great to have you here, and we're going to do a bit of reminiscing, and we're going to do a bit of looking forward over the course of this podcast, for obvious reasons, I suppose. I mean, last week was the 10-year anniversary since the independence referendum. I wonder how you reflect 10 years on what the independence referendum meant for Scotland and continues to mean for the UK.
Crikey, it was just the biggest moment in politics in my lifetime, and I recall as we were building up to it, from the moment where Alex Salmond and the SNP won the majority in the Scottish Parliament and set us on course for the referendum, through to that final week where it looked like things were a bit less certain for the Unionists than they had started. Crikey, was it a roller coaster. And I remember, the poll that had been much talked about in the last few weeks, that poll which had put the Yes campaign ahead, was a really important thing for a couple of reasons. One, politically, it was kind of, wow, this is a change that could lead to the big change that is at the heart of this choice. Equally, emotionally, as somebody in favour of the UK who wanted a reformed UK, but I suddenly got all the emotional charge on the other side of the argument, because what was at stake became so much plainer when you think you're about to lose, or risk losing it. That was big thing for all of us. And it has, of course, resonated for the decade since. And I don't think it's finished. So it's maybe less potent as an issue right now. But I think it's only for the truly mad to say that it's gone away as an issue.
Can I just say, Michael, welcome. It's great to have you on. I don't know if I've told you this before, but you know that poll it was the Times and the Sun that ran it, 52-48. I remember it so well, and I was tasked with phoning literally Rupert Murdoch High Command in New York to try and stop them from publishing it. So because we knew that would really elicit a big reaction, and we tried so hard, literally at every level. So we went through the editors in Scotland, the editors at the UK level, and then punted it to New York and see if we could get Murdoch himself not to publish it, but he wouldn't. He's like, it's too big a story. But I suppose my point is, my recollection is, and I got told this from Ewan, and I can't remember his last name, Special Advisor, a Liberal Democrat Special Advisor, great guy. And I think Ron, that was it, yeah. And he told me, and then I think it was confirmed in a documentary, that you actually had internal polling saying yes 55. And I suppose my question to you is, well, one, is that true? Am I remembering correctly? And secondly, was it just the public reaction to 52-48 that made you come out and kind of get the three amigos, Clegg, Cameron, Miliband up the road, cancelling Parliament, or was that always part of the plan?
They've been called a lot of things. The three amigos might be a slight stretch. But I guess the honest truth is, Geoff, I can't now remember what the internal polling looked like. And by that stage, I was out of the Scotland office and not at the heart of the campaign. I had spent the kind of 10 days or 2 weeks or so before the election, a friend of mine who's in favour of independence and me, we walked the length of the Tweed, a nice big symbolic exercise, and every night we did a public meeting in the community in which we ended up. Very lovely, civilised thing, but it kind of detached us from the comings and goings. But that poll, whether there were other ones that suggested an even bigger lead for the Yes campaign, just electrified things. And I guess if there was no complacency on no side of it. No, everybody was taking it very, very seriously. But as I said before, it suddenly made it very real that this could change. And why wouldn't that generate a great reaction? But I mean, I do admire you trying to tell Rupert Murdoch you've got the biggest political story in recent history. I would love it if you didn't run it. Great.
Yeah, who's this kid following me from Scotland? Yeah, well, they've taken the call though, so I mean that shows you something.
Everybody takes your calls, Geoff. Everybody takes your calls.
Aberdeen's call.
I totally agree with you, and in terms of the reaction, that was, I mean, the following number of days, I think it was 10 days out at that point. I mean, it was electrified. I mean, the whole place was on tenterhooks, and the whole country. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary. Yeah.
When there was the infamous visit of the three amigos to Scotland, I got a call to say, Nick wants to do something, could he come to the borders? Which is, we love our civility, and the way we do politics is a bit, different. We always think to ourselves, until it isn't. But the reality was that, Labour and the Conservatives went off and did highly kind of staged events where the big beasts prowled the stage and everything else. Nick came to Selkirk Town Square, and in the marketplace, basically had a great old 19th century Victorian kind of free-for-all with yes and no. It was a really brilliant occasion. I mean, I slightly felt for Nick because he was in the middle of a melee, and I just stood back and watched as this took place. But it brought to life, again, what mattered to people. There was so much at stake. So it was an electric moment, and if I may say, from my side of the argument, a relief when a few days later it was settled the way it was.
Yeah. Though, I think it's worth...
Andy, yeah. One thing, I just want to come in, and I'll shut up and let you in, sorry. I just wanted to tell you, again, after that poll, I remember being in SNP HQ and phoning, there was a conference call with the government, and a lot of the senior civil servants were on, a lot of communications officials were on, and I had to say to them, this was the first time it dawned on us, so we might win as well. It's like, okay, so we need to start preparing for this one, guys, And governments around the world have been privately getting in touch with the Scottish government saying, right, we'll need a line in to you guys. And so there was this room being set up at Dynamic Earth where the event was going to be for the Yes campaign, where there would be certain phones set up to go through directly to different governments. And I won't go into too much detail because I'm probably not allowed to say too much, but there were certain countries that demanded a certain level of security with their positives, and so when it was extraordinary actually when you think about it. And even it was starting to dawn on us actually we might have done this. It was that moment. It was quite extraordinary. Now, sorry, Andy, you go.
No, I just think it's worth because that was obviously a pretty acutely crazy time of the campaign just before the vote, but it's worth reflecting on why that was actually necessary in the first place. And we've talked quite a lot on this podcast over the time about Salmond and about how effective he was, and yes, he got the yes vote from whatever it was, 28% or something, up to 45%. But and we should reflect that he did very well during that time. But Downing Street ran a shocking campaign. I mean, the Tory part of Downing Street ran a shocking referendum campaign, relentlessly negative. I said last week, I think it was lucky that the Lib Dems were in government at that point to take away some of the rough edges of that. I think it was extraordinarily lucky that Alistair Darling was running Better Together, because I think he was able to turn what was a pretty ugly Downing Street operation into something that was much more effective in Scotland. I actually think that without, obviously I have family bias here, but I think that without Alistair, it could very well have been a yes vote, to be honest with you.
But if you go back to 2012, I think I may have mentioned this once before on the podcast, but I haven't mentioned it often. But I was in Downing Street meeting somebody from the Tory side who had significant enough influence to change the nature of the campaign. And I remember it was about 65-35 at that point. I seem to think it was late 2012, I think it was. And I remember saying, you're going to have to make some sort of offer on what devolution is going to look like. You have to move on devolution. You can't fight this referendum on the status quo. You fight the referendum on the status quo, you might very well lose. And he looked at me like I had three heads and said, no, of course we're not doing anything. I mean, this is going to be status quo. We're not giving an inch. This is going to be status quo and we'll win 65-35. And I remember walking out of Downing Street that day and thinking, wow, this could be difficult. These guys don't get it at all. They just don't understand. And I think the presence of Mike and the Lib Dems, who are, ultimately the presence of decentralisers, of federalisers in there to try and smooth that centralist agenda, probably is underplayed in how important that turned out to be.
I mean, you pick on 2012, and it is an important point in time, but I mean, from the moment when the SNP won their majority in the Scottish Parliament in 2011, actually we were, I think, all quite grateful that all the attention was on Alex Salmond and Scottish Parliament and his assertions about how this would all play out, what type of referendum we would have, gave us a bit of space to resolve at a Westminster level just how to handle it, establish the important principle of a referendum made in Scotland, not imposed by the UK government because constitutional power sat there, but the political reality was a mandate had been secured. And there was some esoteric and some brute politic considerations that were put through the ringer. And in the end, we were able to kind of work our way through to say, right, this is about working through and devolving powers. But you're right, Andy, there were quite a lot of battles over the style of it. And I've said it in other circumstances, the bit I never was comfortable with was this idea of Project Fear and the unrelentingly negative scare tactics of what was going on. Now, I can, in my own head, whatever my culpability, I can separate myself out because I was dispatched from the Scotland office before the campaign, or as the campaign was getting serious. But things like, the Chancellor, Shadow Chancellor, and, Danny Alexander's Chief Secretary basically standing up and saying you can't have the pounds on politically and everything else, all that stuff perfectly sane and sensible. The tone and what it allowed Alex Salmond to come and say, how dare they take it, it's your pound and all this kind of stuff. And there was a danger in the way the whole thing was fought that we, on the union side, were cold or more objective in our political assessment, or objective from our perspective, just let's deal with the kind of cliff edge things between here and here. And what we failed to spot, I think until quite late, was that on the emotional level, what Sam Sturgeon and others were being very skillful at was turning this into something that people could relate to and saying, the future of the NHS is at stake. I was, what? This is ridiculous. This has been devolved since day dot. It's all, and I talked about that meander along the tweets that I did. Again, one of the defining moments for me there was no great debate that I had or how sore my limbs were as I did it. It was actually meeting a school teacher en route who said, "Oh, Michael, good to see you. Always support you. Blah blah blah. How are you doing?" I said, "Oh yeah, what do you think about the referendum?" "Oh, I'm voting yeah." I said, "Why?" "Because the NHS. I'm really worried about the future of the NHS." And I realised, 2 minutes later, I'm still trying to explain why she's got the whole of this wrong, and that usual kind of cliche: if you're explaining, you're losing. And that was a whole feature of the campaign that I wish we could rerun again and just learn the lessons of it. But it seems to me subsequently we've just taken the worst aspect of that campaign and applied it in different circumstances.
You know what's in that? Let me ask Geoff and Mike this, right? Because I've often pondered this. we talk about the vow a lot. The vow is the Smith Commission. The vow is the third iteration of the Scotland Act, right? That's what it led to.
And this is the idea of more powers for Scotland.
Exactly. This is the idea of more powers, which came to pass in the the third Scotland Act, 2016, whatever it was. And many of us were urging the Tories at the time in 2012 to basically go there now, because it was going to happen anyway. So make it a positive offer so that nobody's asking to vote for the status quo, so that a no vote is actually a vote for more devolution, a vote for more change. Now, obviously, they never did that. It is interesting, though, I think, to ponder how that might have changed things and what the result might have been had that been the offer from 2012, from 2011, from 2012, so that there was 2 years of campaigning on that rather than 3 days of desperate bribing, which is what basically the vow was after it appeared in the record. I mean, I think
but Andy,
you're
just
turning
remember,
55 into more than that.
But remember, Alex Salmond, for a big chunk of this, was talking about a 2-question referendum, and Devo Max is an option. And one of the issues for the no side was to say, well, if we play into that, or, how does that game through? So I think the Devo Max thing and being seen to play along with that would make it harder to resist that.
You
being
think Cameron
on the
should have
ballot.
said yes to that then, Mike? That
No,
2-question
I was
referendum.
pretty clear at the time. We needed to. For all I was critical earlier about the manner of it, I wasn't at all at odds with the basic premise, which was we need to make this a clear choice between independence and flush out what each side thinks that involves, and the status quo, knowing, and this is maybe, I'm not suggesting you're wrong in your analysis, but knowing that we had the opportunity, we've won, come back and deliver more on that. And I actually think that the Smith Commission, and the full disclosure, I was on the commission. It was a great and very interesting 6-week period of intense discussions. But the act that followed it delivered the full set of income tax powers and the welfare powers and other things, and actually I think has begun to shape the type of debate we're having in Scotland now about what we can afford, what we need to do with our economy to get the taxes base increased, and make our own choices about elements of the welfare system. So that is not seen as revolutionary, that act, but I think it was really important. So we might have been a bit slow to get there, but we got to a point where the debate is, I think, at a better stage now than it was.
Yeah, a number of things you raise, Michael and Andy. So I'll go through them very quickly. On tone, you're absolutely right. The tone adopted by the No coalition, let's put it that way, I think was particularly unfortunate. And actually, that's what heralded, in my opinion, the SNP dominance that took place thereafter. I will say this to you, not just because you're on the call. I said this to you at a dinner that we were at in sometime 2017, I think it was, that I thought one of the mistakes the campaign made was replacing you, Michael Moore, by Alistair Carmichael. It's not to say I don't rate Alistair Carmichael as a politician, but the whole idea was that he was going to be more direct in his combating of the SNP. I think that misunderstood the moment, actually, and I think what it needed was more sober, calm, perhaps empathetic analysis and campaigning from that side. And I think you provided that. And privately, in the campaign, I can tell you this, we were all rather pleased when you were replaced. And that's genuine. That is absolutely genuine. And I think, John Swinney would admit that as well. I think he did. He was at that dinner we were at. So I think he did concede that. Secondly, on Andy's point about, the Devo Max position, I've always maintained that we were looking as a campaign at what Labour would do, because they were our principal opponents. At this point, they were still running supreme at Westminster level in terms of Scottish seats. What would Labour do as part of this campaign? And when they kind of failed to come up with their own Labour offer, which would have been a natural enhanced devolution pitch, in my opinion, when they didn't do that, we were very, very pleased as well. Now, I think they should have got there a lot sooner. They got there in the end because it was extracted out of you with the vow and all the rest of it, but I felt that they should have been there, and perhaps the Liberal Democrats could have played a role in that as well. But one thing that I think the SNP didn't do as part of the Smith Commission, post the referendum, the SNP had unrivaled political capital. I mean, literally, we were talk of the steamy. We had really pushed the UK establishment to a place where they didn't want to be. That was the time to try and codify the circumstances that another referendum might take place. I think that the three parties may well have accommodated that time. You've got to remember, put yourself in that post-referendum period and try to codify the circumstances to which you could have another referendum that would be agreed by both governments. And I think that was the time to do it. And I think that's the big regret from the Yes campaign side.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because my kind of profession was leaving the studio in Glasgow on the night, or by the stage, well into the morning after the referendum, and No had won the day. I'm driving along the M8 and nearly veer off at Hart Hill, or whatever, because I hear the Prime Minister saying we're now going to do English votes for English laws, and I just thought, what are we doing here? And there's so many different ways into how the SNP's vote was turbocharged thereafter, but it was extraordinary to me that was the response. Whereas if we had taken a view that said, right, we've got through this, let's reorientate the constitutional settlement so that Scotland can decide when it wants to decide its constitutional future or whatever it might be. You'd have been the magnanimous victors instead of saying, right, you no longer count, we're off to do something else. It was absolutely bizarre.
We were rubbing our hands, could not believe it, absolutely devastated in the aftermath of the result. Here he comes outside number 10 and starts going, right, that's done. Right, let's talk about England. And we thought, you beauty. They just don't get it.
But that's it though, right? That's exactly it. It's the same mentality. This is where you have to understand the Tory party mentality. The same mentality that does English votes for English laws the next day. That's the same mentality that leads to Mike being replaced as Scottish Secretary. I've got a huge amount of time for Alistair Carmichael. I think he's a very impressive guy. But he is a more combative politician than Michael Moore, right? And that's what the Tories want. I mean, at the end of the day, the approach of the Tory party towards the SNP and towards Scotland is that it's supposed to be a fight. It's not supposed to be cooperative. It's not two governments working together. It's a fight. That's what it's always been. That's what it still is today. That's what it's been for the last 10 years. And they want people who will fight nationalists. That's the job. And so these things are all part of the same mentality. So it all works. It all fits if you understand the psyche of them.
Can I just, on Alistair, I count Alistair as a good friend to this day. It wasn't a great moment in time for me when I was replaced. But on the other hand, I absolutely could see Alistair being hugely capable of the job. He's a very, very canny, highly experienced politician, and he's obviously now just emerged as the new chair of one of the select committees at Westminster, and good luck to the people who appear in front of him, kind of thing. But he was kind of set up for it. But on one hand, and to a small extent, I was responsible. I refused to resign because I was offered the chance to resign, and I thought, I'm not. When Nick rang me and said, I'm not resigning because I don't believe I've done anything wrong, and I'm certainly not. Why would I do that? So I said, if you've made a choice to freshen up the team and take a different tack, that's fine. But so you get rid of me and you pick the new guy. That then slightly said, you had to answer the question, why have you done it? And it was, we're moving into a new phase of the campaign. So in fairness to Alistair, it wasn't the easiest of setups thereafter. But as part of a broader theme that it was all now going to get a bit more kind of Punch and Judy and all that kind of stuff, I'm not sure it was going to work. It did in the end. They prevailed, we prevailed, still feel that way about it. And so I guess we can now dispatch it all to the very dull books that I've still got mine to write, by the way, so just be careful if you want to fall asleep somewhere in the next 10 years. I'll have the answer.
You let us know when it's published. You can give us the interview about it. That'll be good. I just wanted to ask, is kind of with these sorts of themes in mind, Geoff has mentioned the Edinburgh Agreement on this podcast before, and the amount of stuff basically that the SNP got from that to determine the length of the campaign, to draft the question, who was going to be voting.
there's a certain set of documentaries out there at the moment where, dare I say, this is one of the few things in which there's unanimous agreement that somehow Geoff, in his mastermind way, delivered this great deal. If I'm allowed a minor corrective to all that,
That's why you're here.
We had a clear view that we wanted a single question by a certain time on a one-off basis. That was what mattered. Equally, on the question, I mean, I do take point, by the way, I've seen you articulate this, Geoff. The yes-no thing was indeed problematic, and we'd have much rather have had the yes moniker. It's much more positive and all that kind of stuff. So that's I get that point of it. But one of the battles that I had was to say to everybody, we need to just trust the Electoral Commission to do its job, because nobody actually gets to make the question up. They have to put it through the Electoral Commission, and while they do not tell you what it is, they give you a view. And I heard lots of Labour people and others saying, you're mad, you've given this away. I said, look, if we've got the Electoral Commission looking over it, if they make changes, the SNP will accept them immediately, because they'll be the first political party anywhere in the United Kingdom to reject the advice if they don't. And they did change the question, and they did make it perfectly neutral and fair, and off we went. And the Edinburgh Agreement, the point of that was the small bit of legislation, well, small but very significant bit of legislation we devolved through the Section 30 order, which gave the Scottish Parliament the power to make this referendum in Scotland, was accompanied by a whole set of agreements around how the process would run, i.e., under normal rules. You couldn't set up a new Scottish election body to make the rules up. You couldn't have somebody else opine on the question that was new to that. That was hugely important to the sense of confidence that this would be a fair referendum that would be legally watertight at the end of it. So, yes, along the way, there was brilliant campaigning and brilliant negotiating by Geoff and colleagues. But fundamentally, what we needed to get, we got.
Yeah, I'm just, you mentioned Devo Max earlier on, and I think, I don't want to misrepresent, the situation. I think Michael's putting forward, a fairly accurate description of the negotiations. I think the point was that we wanted people to really believe that we were going after Devo Max. Now, had the UK government turned around and said, yeah, you can get that in the question, we'd have taken that. It was almost like a win-win for Salmond, because his view was that if we got Devo Max in the paper, that's people of Scotland would definitely go for the middle option. Nobody wants to just keep things the same. They'd vote for the next one, and then it's more gradualism. I mean, Alex Salmond was a gradualist, amazingly, but back then, perhaps not now. And so we knew that going in and using that as a bargaining chip, it made the other discussions go reasonably well, I think, and it worked to a degree that when we did get the question, you're absolutely right about the Electoral Commission, but we were not sure, Michael, that we were going to get the question as it was framed and be able to pitch our tent on the yes. It wasn't clear throughout the start. I remember being in Downing Street at the start going, this is going to take a bit of work. So you had to have your negotiating position there in order to try and extract that, because that was the most important thing for us.
Well,
and then the franchise and all the rest of it.
You say that, although from my perspective as a Scot in the midst of this, I thought anything that smacked of Westminster telling the Scottish Parliament what to do would be a disaster. And if there was lots of chat about, should we write the question into the Section 30 order, and that's it.
That's
done.
right. Mm.
And I would say to them, can you imagine what Alex Salmond will do with that? Wouldn't matter if it was, we think you should all vote for independence, do you agree? As whatever question we'd put in there would have been Westminster's question. We're having this imposed on us. And the key thing that, again, there were a few Scots and the Lib Dem side of it who we, put through the different bits of the discussions over those crucial months, was this had to be made in Scotland. And there was some risk attached to that. But frankly, if we couldn't win the argument on the fundamentals, after the tactical stuff had been dealt with, how you got the thing up and running, then, Helmendous kind of thing.
No, I have to say, I think Salmond and Cameron both got that wrong, though. I think Salmond was daft to offer Devo Max, and I think Cameron was daft to refuse it, because it would have won by a mile. We know from polling at the time. In fact, we were doing polling for the Devo Plus campaign at that time. It was very clear that would have won by a distance, and it would have won by a much greater margin to put this whole issue to bed. We wouldn't have then spent the last 10 years. We spent the last 10 years not worrying about the fact that kids go to school and can't do fractions, and the fact the economy's collapsed, and the fact the NHS has collapsed. We haven't talked about any of these things, so we're talking about independence all the time. We wouldn't have been talking about that if it had been a 75-25 win, which it would have been for Devo Max.
And then people will say, well, we didn't get the proper question on independence, and that would have fueled everything. These counterfactuals are fascinating, but fundamentally problematic, because we've got now a more advanced devolution settlement than we had. Whether it's what would you put on the Devo Max ballot would have been the other thing. Is it would have meant whatever you wanted it to mean, and that was another weakness. Whereas where we got to was a very specific set of proposals that came in through legislation. Look, it was messy. Hey, politics as often is. And you raised a really important point, though, Andy. I said at the start, I don't believe for a minute that this issue is gone and can't be resurrected, and fortunes of political parties and political movements come and go. But my goodness, wouldn't it be great if we could have a conversation in Scotland about how to grow the economy, how to get investment in the right places, and actually look and see, are we winning compared to other parts of the United Kingdom, never mind against our expectation?
Yeah. Michael, you're being very generous with your time. I know you're a busy man, and there's a couple of other things we want to touch on, if you don't mind. It's fascinating insight on the independence referendum. I do just want to reflect that this is also the 25th year of devolution, and actually towards the start of this year in March, we did a podcast special, and among others, we heard from Lord Wallace, Jim Wallace, who of course was there and was a key part of those early years of devolution. And it strikes me how history repeats itself, and how we often have conversations about coalition, and how the Lib Dems have been at the heart of several coalition governments now, both in Scotland and in the UK level as well. That, of course, is when you were in the cabinet too. Do you think fondly of your coalition years? Was that a time that was constructive and successful for the nation?
That's a slightly loaded question, Calum, if I might suggest.
It's my job, I'm sorry.
But actually, if I may just pick up the first coalition that you referenced there,
please do.
Was that I was a relatively new MP who was elected in 1997. I was working closely with Jim, and part of the negotiations with Labour that created the partnership agreement, as we lovingly called it for a long time. And that was a good early test of how you could create coalitions. It was actually a model that, when we went into the negotiations in 2010, was drawn out from, because Labour had rather assumed in 98 that they could just say what was, or 99, sorry, just get us to sign up to the existing arrangements. We insisted on having a negotiation, and that's where their pledge card versus a classic Lib Dem 40-page detailed manifesto meant that we had some advantage in being able to get stuff in there. We copied that in 2010, and I think, if we're honest ourselves now, we were over pleased with getting the coalition agreement signed and forgetting the old Macmillan thing about events, dear boy, events. You're immediately into lots of other things that derail you, or you have to cope with, that are not covered by that kind of document. And you do things like you're going to abolish tuition fees, which you don't do, and you've got something to have hung around you for, frankly, a decade and more afterwards. That's dogged the party. Do I think of it fondly? I mean, it was a pretty tough time. I mean, personally, I would be dishonest not to say it was an amazing time for me. I got the chance to be a minister. We've just been talking about some of the historic moments that were going on at that stage. And I look back now and think, what should we have done differently? I think the mechanics of it, we can argue it to the cows come home. The mood music around austerity, particularly some of the stuff around, or a lot of the stuff around welfare reform, we were not nearly robust enough on bringing a different perspective to those, and paid a long price for that, or paid a price for a long time. And only last week, when I was at the Brighton Lib Dem conference, did I see the first signs of the party enjoying itself, because it's now got a historically huge number of MPs, but it's taken a long time to go back to a position of political health.
Yeah, parallels with the Labour Party as well, Michael. I mean, it's taken this long for the Liberal Democrats to almost be seen as a credible electoral alternative since post that period. I suppose a couple of reflections that I have. I remember the time really well. Obviously, we were in government. And in fairness to the Liberals, you've got to remember what it was like back then. I think it was 22 days that there was no government. It took that long to try and form the government, because there was clearly a lot of going back and forth. Gordon Brown was trying to set up an alternative coalition. And I think the Liberals felt they kind of owed it as a public duty to the country to get something sorted in many ways. And so I do have a degree of sympathy. But there's two things that I thought that, in reflection. One was the tuition fees pledge. Mick Clegg had travelled every single constituency. Their tuition fees will be abolished. That was their big pledge. And then that was sacrificed on the altar immediately. And I thought that was a real problem for you, because politically, if you can defend that sort of policy, and it's playing into the wheelhouse of your natural constituency for the Liberals, then you could always hold on to that. That's a real win for us going forward into the next 5 years. That went. And then the second thing that you got was the referendum on voting reform, proportional representation, which was, I mean, hardly, talk of dinner tables around the country, let's be honest. And you kind of got outfoxed by your Tories there, your coalition partners there. I feel those two things were quite symbolic for the Liberals, and it gave Clegg, who is actually a lot more capable, I think, that history might regard, nothing to fight with, nothing to chew over, nothing to hold on to and say, look, but we did that. And I just felt that not standing up, I don't know if the Liberals realised how powerful you were. You really were the kingmakers. Final question, Michael, just put on that. To the extent that you could have stopped the referendum on Brexit, presumably. And maybe it's your fault.
Oh, thanks. One of the things I love about Holyrood Sources is the way you string together the most amazing set of things. And I'm going to resist quite a lot of that bait. And while mildly correct you, it's been the Liberal Democrats for about 40 years, but don't worry. When it comes to what we could have done, yeah, there's a lot of there was sort of lived hindsight. We lived it every day. We could see where things might just have been a wee bit better if we had anticipated things. I mean, when this properly tediously dull book that I've got in my head gets committed to print, I will put at least a chapter into the comedy, if it weren't so serious, of the tuition fees debacle. I mean, it was just terrible and reflects poorly on all of us, both in terms of the pledge, the way we then worked it through government, and where we end up. In the actual infamous vote, we end up with 3 different places. Government ministers voting for it, loyalists taking the coalition agreement opt-out, which we had secured, and the people who were really, really fed up and didn't like the direction of travel in the back benches voting against it. And it was just awful. And I mean, I was caught out by the Daily Telegraph coming and doing a sting at a constituency surgery. And at the time, I stand by what I said then, we broke trust, and it was really, really hard to get it back. The AV referendum was just bizarre, because there's not a person I know in the Lib Dems who's ever seriously advanced it as a great reform.
That's...
We were also, however, there was some support in the country for it, and then the Conservatives quite smartly realised they had to stop being neutral on it and start campaigning against it. So again, it's a bit of feistiness after that moment in time. Look, there was one of the major things for us was actually producing stability, which was at the time a much undervalued thing. I think we've learned subsequently that kind of stability is, if not priceless, at least worth having around it. Although everybody now claims it as theirs, the increase in the personal tax allowance to take some of the lower income households out of tax altogether, that was clearly a Lib Dem idea. And one of the things that, self-praise is no honour, as my father would keep telling me. But the chance I got to do the 0.7 bill in terms of development spending and committing to the UN target, that was a coalition agreement. But strangely, we hadn't been given the time to do it. So as a backbencher, I was able to get on with that. So, selfishly and more generally, there were plenty of things we were pleased with. I mean, we did a piece of Scottish Parliament devolution in that time that was also pretty important. So around the patch, it's not remembered particularly fondly by many in the Lib Dems or perhaps by the country. But I think the fact is that 10 years on, we've hopefully put that behind us and we've got a whole new era to look forward to.
Well, that's the interesting point. Is just one thing on Geoff on Brexit. Of course, that I think was Cameron's plan in 2015, is that the Lib Dems would stop Brexit, but then he accidentally got a majority and they didn't have the chance to do so. But there you go, that was history. 2026 might. There's a reasonable chance, I think more than reasonable chance, that Alex Cole-Hamilton could lead a party which will be the kingmaker, and which will have a chance not only to put either Labour or the SNP, and I'm not being facetious when I say or the SNP, because we might be in a different constitutional era at that point, into government. I mean, do you think that's realistic? Would you encourage them to go for it? You referenced the article I had in the Herald the weekend, where I said I think the Lib Dems have got a pretty historic opportunity at this point, both UK-wide and in Scotland, but they need to move a little bit to exploit that. Is it something which you think is a real... I mean, are people thinking to themselves, we could well be in government in Scotland in 18 months' time and we should be going for it?
I think the mood is undoubtedly transformed from where it was even a year ago, because there's now a really impressive general election outcome under the party's belt. I think what Ed Davey achieved in the election after what I think candidly all of us really thought was a slightly challenging beginning. But he turned the photo ops into he earned permission to be part of a debate, and he brought some pretty serious subjects like social care right into the mainstream of the election campaign, while also in the south of England, giving people a vehicle to make a judgment on the government that had gone before. I think to your point about Scotland being a very different beast, nevertheless, the confidence and enthusiasm, seeps through, and I think that the party will be much more ambitious north of the border. We've now, over 25 years, had a couple of, or 2 or 3 different experiences of coalition. I'd like to think the party will be much better prepared for that kind of moment, be clear on its own mind about what it looks for from a partner, what it will do to achieve. Back to Geoff's challenge from earlier, loads that can be done, leverage it. Dare I say it? I don't know what kind of a problem I might bring upon myself for saying this. I think the way in which the Greens worked their way through coalition, whether you approved of the policies or the behaviours or of different bits of all of that, they were pretty effective in the way they used the mechanisms of the arrangement with the SNP for a very long time. And the Lib Dems, we probably were too pliant back in the past. But there's a few more battle scars, a lot more muscle memory now that can be applied. And trying to be optimistic about it, I think that there's definitely a centre ground in Scottish politics that wants to hear a serious set of arguments about the economy, as well as reform of the public services that get us on the front foot and addressing all the issues that Andy rightly says. I don't think we can blame independents for not discussing them, but we really do have to get on and discuss how to bring Scotland to the fore in all the public services in terms of economic performance, which sadly at the moment we can't, hand on heart, say we've managed.
Yeah. And with
Michael,
that,
can I just ask a question?
Sorry,
If
Geoff.
anybody thought, sorry, I know time's running out, and you've been so great with your time. It's been fascinating. But would you ever be tempted back, Mike, to elected politics? Because it does strike me that somebody of your skill set, and now that you've had the experience of being out, getting a real job, in between times,
He doesn't need any free clothes. Look at that shirt. It's beautiful. He doesn't need a free shirt and free glasses. He's fine.
No, but seriously, would you not be? Would you ever be tempted back either at Holyrood or Westminster?
No. I'm just thrilled. I'm gonna write that quote out. Mike has a real job, and that will be my Geoff Aberdein endorsement. I saw some of my former colleagues in Brighton, and who've just got themselves re-elected. I've chatted to people like Douglas Alexander and others. My first reaction always is, "You're utterly mad." But can I say I completely admire them. I think anybody who is in politics today is a much tougher gig than it was. It was we thought it was tough in the late 90s, and through all my time, 18 years in Westminster, it's nothing to what it is today. The scrutiny, the relentlessness of it, and frankly, the nature of the decisions that they're having to grapple with. So I admire all of them, but I think I've processed a lot after 2015. And I am very happy to be able to contribute to the debate when it's appropriate, but there's a great new generation who can take the battle forward.
Obviously, this week, Mike, we've been watching the Labour Party's first conference as the party of government. And I think it's fair to say the Chancellor's striking a slightly different tone, perhaps, this week than she has over the last few weeks. There seems to be a real enthusiasm. In fact, let me read you this from Kate McCann, who's Times Radio's political editor. She says, complete change of tone, literally from Chancellor Rachel Reeves on Times Radio, explaining she's excited about the future of the country. Even her voice is different. You can hear her smiling as she talks. There's a clear effort to lift the mood. And I just wonder, with your real job in mind, whether you are identifying something of a change here, that the Labour government has been criticised for being quite doom and gloom since it took office over the last few weeks. Is there a tone change that's important and necessary at this point?
I'm afraid Geoff just ruined his earlier comment by sniggering as you mentioned my real job. Can I just say, I get the politics of the last couple of months in terms of creating a kind of clear, kind of common memory of what has gone before. It's a particular view from the Labour Party, Labour government about what's gone before, and that's not my business to get into that. But it has created this need for a pivot to build on what before the election was a very strong set of growth messages. I mean, it was in my job promoting investment across the United Kingdom and the conditions that will attract more of it from our industry. It's been really relatively simple to talk to the political parties. I was at the SNP conference recently, the Lib Dems here at the Labour going on to the Conservatives, because everybody's obsessed with growth. We need growth in the economy, and that's been really helpful. We've had a couple of months where other things have been the big picture argument. So I'm looking forward to hearing what goes through from here to the budget and beyond, because we do have some big challenges and we do need to change things. I think that if we get the substance of what's going to be behind that high level messaging about we're here for growth, then I think we will see things move on quite quickly. And I'm not really qualified to comment on this bit of it, but the political change of gear from one set of messages to another it can be quite hard to do. But at a conference, there's no better place. And so I would be very surprised after Labour's conference, the tone isn't quite different, building up to what will still be quite a challenging budget, but needs to lay the foundations, we would hope, for investment and other things which will fire up the growth.
Michael Moore, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, thank you for listening to the podcast. More importantly, though, thank you for joining us to speak on the podcast today. It's been great to chat to you.
And thanks for having me. Great fun.
Mike, thank you.